The air inside the dungeon was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the faint echo of Jinwoo's footsteps against the cold stone floor. His sharp eyes scanned the dimly lit corridors, every sense on high alert. This wasn't just any dungeon, it was alive, whispering in a language only he could hear, taunting him with promises of power and threats of annihilation. Jinwoo tightened his grip on the dagger in his hand, its blade glinting under the flickering torchlight. He had come here for one reason: to grow stronger. Ever since awakening as a player, he had faced countless battles, each one pushing him closer to his limits. But this dungeon was different. It wasn't just monsters he had to fight, it was the dungeon itself, a sentient labyrinth that played with his mind as much as it tested his body. A low, guttural chuckle echoed through the halls, sending a chill down his spine. "Welcome, Shadow Monarch," the voice hissed, dripping with mockery. "Do you truly believe you can conquer me?" Jinwoo smirked. "I don't believe. I know." Without warning, the ground beneath him trembled, and jagged spikes of stone erupted from the floor. He twisted mid-air, narrowly avoiding the deadly protrusions, his reflexes honed from years of survival. Landing gracefully, he activated Ruler's authority, summoning an invisible force that crushed the spikes into dust. The dungeon growled in frustration. "Clever," it sneered. "But let's see how you handle this." The walls shifted, revealing a horde of grotesque creatures, twisted amalgamations of flesh and shadow, their glowing red eyes fixed on him. They lunged, claws outstretched, but Jinwoo was faster. His dagger flashed, slicing through the first monster's throat before it could react. Shadows coiled around his arm as he activated shadow extraction, pulling the fallen creature's essence into himself. A new soldier joined his army, rising from the darkness at his feet. The dungeon roared in outrage. "You dare steal from me?" Jinwoo didn't answer. He was already moving, his body a blur as he weaved through the onslaught. Each strike was precise, each counter flawless. When a beast tried to flank him, his shadow soldier intercepted, tearing into its flesh with savage efficiency. The battle was a dance of death, Jinwoo's agility and strategic mind pitted against the dungeon's endless waves of minions. But then the dungeon changed tactics. The ceiling above him cracked open, and a massive hand, composed of writhing tendrils, reached down to crush him. Jinwoo's eyes widened. This was no ordinary monster. It was the dungeon's core, its true form manifesting. He rolled to the side just as the hand slammed into the ground, sending shockwaves through the chamber. "Now you see," the dungeon gloated. "You are nothing but an insect in my domain." Jinwoo wiped blood from his lip, his breathing steady despite the chaos. He had faced worse. With a deep breath, he summoned his full strength, shadows erupting from his body like living tendrils. Shadow Monarch's domain enveloped the battlefield, darkening the air as his army of shadows doubled, then tripled in size. The dungeon hesitated, sensing the shift in power. "You're right," Jinwoo said, his voice cold. "This is your domain. But I don't conquer domains." His shadows surged forward, swallowing the dungeon's minions whole. "I rule them." The final battle had only just begun. The dungeon walls trembled as Jinwoo's shadow soldiers clashed against the sentient stone guardians, their massive fists cracking the ground with each missed strike. The air hummed with malice, the dungeon's voice echoing from every direction, taunting him. "You are nothing but a trespasser," sung Jinwoo. "Your strength is borrowed, fleeting." Jinwoo gritted his teeth, his dagger flashing as he severed a guardian's arm mid-swing, shadows surging to consume the rubble. "Borrowed or not," he muttered, "it's enough to shut you up." But the dungeon wasn't done. A low, guttural laugh reverberated through the cavern, and the ground split open, revealing a writhing mass of dark tendrils, each one pulsing with the same eerie intelligence. Worse, the shadows he'd relied on began to twist unnaturally, resisting his commands. The dungeon was learning, adapting. Across the chamber, his elite shadow, Igris, staggered as his form flickered, the dungeon's influence seeping into their bond. "Master," Igris growled, his voice strained, "it's fighting back." Before Jinwoo could react, a figure emerged from the darkness, a hunter he recognized. Li Jui, her healing magic flickering erratically around her, her eyes glazed over. "Jui?" Jinwoo's grip on his dagger tightened. She shouldn't have been here. She'd vanished weeks ago, presumed dead. But the way she moved was wrong, her steps jerky, her hands contorted into claws. The dungeon's voice dripped from her lips. "You left them behind, Shadow Monarch. Now they're mine." Jinwoo's stomach dropped. The dungeon hadn't just been watching, it had been collecting. Jui lunged, her healing magic now a corrosive green, searing the air where it passed. Jinwoo barely sidestepped, but the tendrils lashed out, wrapping around his ankle. He sliced through them, but more surged forward, forcing him back. Igris roared, cutting a path toward Jui, but she twisted midair, slamming a knee into his helm, the impact sending him skidding across the stone. Jinwoo's mind raced. He couldn't kill her, but he couldn't let her kill him either. The dungeon was playing dirty, turning his own hesitation against him. He summoned Beru, the Ant King's massive form crashing into the fray, mandibles snapping at the tendrils. "Restrain her," Jinwoo ordered. "Don't kill." Beru's claws closed around Jui's arms, but she screamed, her magic flaring like a detonation. The blast sent Beru reeling, his carapace smoking. The dungeon laughed. "Your compassion is a weakness." Jinwoo's shadow soldiers faltered, their forms wavering as the dungeons will press down on them. He needed to act fast. With a sharp gesture, he recalled his shadows, absorbing their energy into himself. His body burned with the surge of power, and he dashed forward, his dagger aimed not at Jui, but at the ground beneath her. The blade struck, shadows erupting in a whirlwind, severing the tendrils connected to her. For a split second, her eyes cleared. Jinwoo? Then she collapsed. But the dungeon wasn't finished. The walls began to bleed, the stone melting into a grotesque mimicry of flesh, teeth and eyes forming along its surface. A new voice joined the cacophony, deep, ancient. "You disrupt the balance, little shadow." The ceiling split open, revealing a monstrous maw, rows of jagged teeth descending. Jinwoo barely rolled aside as it snapped shut where he'd stood, the impact shaking the entire dungeon. Igris and Beru regrouped beside him, their forms flickering but resolute. "We can't fight this thing head on," Jinwoo muttered. The dungeon was the battlefield itself. He needed to hit its core. His eyes locked onto a pulsating vein running along the far wall, a weak point. "Igris, distract it." "Beru, with me." Igris charged, his greatsword carving through the fleshy tendrils, drawing the dungeon's attention. Jinwoo and Beru raced along the wall, dodging snapping teeth and lashing appendages. As they neared the vein, the dungeon shrieked, the entire chamber convulsing. The ground beneath them liquefied, swallowing Beru whole. Jinwoo barely leapt clear, but the dungeon's voice was triumphant. "You are alone now, Shadow Monarch." Jinwoo smirked. "Wrong." From the shadows at his feet, Beru erupted, his form reforged, mandibles clamping onto the pulsating vein. The dungeon screamed as black ichor sprayed, the walls shuddering violently. Jinwoo didn't hesitate, he plunged his dagger deep into the wound, shadows exploding outward like a bomb. The dungeon's voice fragmented into a chorus of wails, the walls crumbling around them. As the dust settled, Jinwoo knelt beside Jui, her breathing shallow but steady. The dungeon was silent, for now. But the victory felt hollow. If it could turn hunters against him, who else had it claimed? And worse, what if it wasn't the only one? He clenched his fists. This wasn't over. The air inside the dungeon was thick with the scent of damp stone and something far older, something that whispered of ancient malice. Jinwoo's boots crunched over shattered bones as he advanced, his shadow soldiers flanking him like a living tide. The walls pulsed with an eerie glow, veins of mana threading through the rock like luminescent roots. He'd faced countless dungeons before, but this one was different. This one spoke. "Hunter," sung Jinwoo, the voice echoed, not from any one direction but from the very air itself, a chorus of whispers that slithered into his ears. "You've come far, but you walk a path already written." Jinwoo's grip tightened around his dagger. "Show yourself," he demanded, voice steady despite the cold prickle at the back of his neck. Laughter rippled through the chamber, and then the ground trembled. The bones at his feet rattled, rising into the air as if pulled by invisible strings. They clattered together, forming a towering figure, a skeletal monstrosity with eyes of flickering blue flame. But it wasn't just bones. The dungeon's voice poured into it, giving the creature a mouth that twisted into a grin. "You seek answers," it said, stepping forward with a creak of ancient joints. "But will you like what you find?" Before Jinwoo could react, the creature lunged. Its speed was unnatural, a blur of bone and shadow. He barely dodged, feeling the rush of air as skeletal fingers grazed his throat. His shadow soldiers surged forward, but the creature moved through them like smoke, its form dissolving and reforming at will. "Your shadows are nothing here," it taunted. "This is my domain." Jinwoo's mind raced. Physical attacks were useless, this thing wasn't bound by the same rules as other monsters. He needed a new strategy. As the creature lunged again, he feinted left, then rolled right, slamming his palm against the ground. "Arise," he commanded. The shadows beneath the creature writhed, tendrils of darkness coiling around its legs. For a moment, it staggered, then laughed. Clever. But not enough. With a flick of its wrist, the shadows shattered like glass. Jinwoo gritted his teeth. This wasn't working. He needed to think bigger. Then, a voice cut through the chaos, one he hadn't expected. Jinwoo. Behind you. He turned just in time to see Cha Haein burst into the chamber, her sword blazing with golden light. She swung, the blade carving a searing arc through the air. The creature hissed, recoiling as the holy energy scorched its bones. What are you doing here? Jinwoo snapped, equal parts relieved and furious. Saving your stubborn ass, she shot back, eyes locked on the enemy. Now focus. The creature recovered quickly, its form shifting, bones rearranging into something even more grotesque, a towering knight clad in ethereal armor, a sort of black flame materializing in its grasp. 2 hunters, it mused. How delightful. The fight escalated into a whirlwind of steel and shadow. Haein's holy strikes kept the creature at bay, but it adapted, learning her patterns. Jinwoo wove through the chaos, searching for an opening. Then he saw it, a flicker in the creature's core, a pulsating orb of condensed mana. The source of its power. Hit it now, he shouted, darting forward. Haein didn't hesitate. She channeled every ounce of her energy into one final strike, the light so blinding it seared Jinwoo's eyes. The creature screamed as the holy blade pierced its chest, and for a split second, it faltered. Jinwoo moved. His dagger plunged into the orb, shattering it with a deafening crack. The creature's form exploded into a storm of bone and shadow, the dungeon itself shuddering as if in pain. Silence fell. Then, the voice returned, weaker now, but still dripping with venom. You've won this battle, Hunter. But the war is far from over. The walls began to crumble, the dungeon collapsing in on itself. Jinwoo grabbed Haein's arm. We need to go. Now. As they sprinted for the exit, the truth settled over him like a weight. This wasn't just another dungeon. It was a trap, one designed specifically for him. And if it could speak, if it could think, then what else was out there? The stakes had just gotten higher. And Jinwoo wasn't sure he was ready for what came next. The air inside the dungeon was thick with mana, pressing against Jinwoo's skin like a suffocating blanket. The walls pulsed with an eerie glow, veins of crimson energy snaking across the stone as if the dungeon itself were alive. And then it spoke. Hunter sung Jinwoo. You are not welcome here. The voice echoed from every direction, deep and resonant, vibrating through his bones. Jinwoo smirked, rolling his shoulders as shadows coiled around his arms. Didn't think dungeons had opinions. A monstrous roar shook the chamber as the floor split open, jagged spikes of obsidian erupting beneath his feet. Jinwoo leapt back, flipping midair as the spikes chased him. He landed in a crouch, his dagger already drawn. The dungeon wasn't just alive, it was fighting back. A hulking figure emerged from the darkness, its body composed of the same shifting stone as the walls. The Guardian's eyes burned with molten fire, and it swung a massive fist straight for Jinwoo's head. He ducked, feeling the wind from the blow ruffle his hair. The follow-up kick came faster, slamming into his ribs and sending him skidding across the floor. Gritting his teeth, Jinwoo pushed himself up. His ribs screamed in protest, but his regeneration was already stitching the damage. The Guardian charged again, its movements impossibly fluid for something so massive. Jinwoo waited until the last second before sidestepping, slashing his dagger across the creature's arm. Black blood splattered the ground, sizzling like acid. The dungeon rumbled in anger. You cannot win. Jinwoo's shadow soldiers erupted from the ground, their forms twisting into existence. Let's test that. The battlefield erupted into chaos. Archers loosed volleys of shadow arrows while armored knights clashed with the Guardian, their blades sparking against its stone hide. Jinwoo wove between them, striking with precision, each cut aimed at the cracks in the Guardian's armor. But the dungeon wasn't done. The walls shifted, spewing forth tendrils of dark energy that lashed out like whips. One caught Jinwoo across the back, sending him crashing to his knees. Blood dripped from his lips as he forced himself up. His soldiers were being torn apart, their forms dissolving into smoke. He needed more. With a roar, Jinwoo unleashed his full power. His shadow swelled, consuming the light as his stats surged. The Guardian hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Jinwoo blurred forward, his dagger plunging into the creature's chest. The Guardian staggered, its body cracking like breaking stone. Then, silence. But the dungeon wasn't finished. The ground trembled, the voice growing louder. You are strong. But strength alone will not save you. The ceiling split open, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness. Jinwoo's eyes widened as a colossal hand reached down, fingers the size of tree trunks curling toward him. This wasn't just a dungeon. It was a gate. And something far worse was coming. The dungeon trembled as Jinwoo stepped forward, his shadow soldiers surging around him like a living tide. The air was thick with mana, crackling with the weight of impending destruction. The dungeon's voice echoed through the cavern, a deep, mocking laughter that made the very stones shudder. "You've come far, Hunter Sung Jinwoo, but this is where you fall." Jinwoo clenched his fists, his muscles coiled like springs. He had fought countless battles, but this was different. This dungeon wasn't just a monster. It was alive. It thought. It spoke. And it knew him. The ground erupted as obsidian spikes shot upward, impaling 3 of his shadow soldiers in an instant. Jinwoo barely twisted aside, feeling the rush of air as a spike grazed his ribs. He didn't flinch. Pain was an old friend. Instead, he grinned, his eyes burning with determination. "You talk too much." With a flick of his wrist, his remaining shadows lunged, their forms blurring as they struck. The dungeon roared, its walls splitting open to reveal gaping maws lined with jagged teeth. Shadows were devoured, crushed, torn apart, but Jinwoo didn't stop. He weaved through the chaos, his dagger flashing as he carved a path straight for the dungeon's core, a pulsating orb of dark energy embedded in the far wall. The dungeon's voice turned frantic. "You cannot win. I am endless. I am." Jinwoo's fist slammed into the core. A shockwave ripped outward, throwing him back as cracks spiderwebbed across the orb. The dungeon screamed, its form destabilizing, its body crumbling. But Jinwoo wasn't done. He pushed himself up, blood dripping from his lip, and raised both hands. "You're right," he growled. "You are endless. But so am I." His shadows converged, merging into a single, colossal fist of darkness. With a final, earth-shattering impact, it drove straight into the core, and the dungeon exploded. Light swallowed everything. The walls, the monsters, even the air itself, gone in an instant. Jinwoo felt himself falling, weightless, until his back hit the ground. The silence was deafening. Then, the dust settled. He was alive. The dungeon was dead. Jinwoo exhaled, his body aching, his mind racing. He had won, but at what cost? Around him, the remnants of his shadow army flickered, weakened but still standing. He could feel their loyalty, their unshakable bond. He had pushed them, and himself, beyond their limits. And then, the realization hit. The system had changed. A new prompt flickered before his eyes, glowing gold, dungeon conquered. Authority expanded. Jinwoo's pulse quickened. He had done more than just survive. He had taken control. Beyond the ruins of the dungeon, the world outside would never be the same. Guilds would scramble for answers. Governments would panic. And the gates would respond. But for now, Jinwoo stood, wiping the blood from his face. He had broken the rules. And from this moment on, he would make his own. The hunt was far from over.